You know that feeling? When you really want to get something, understand the hidden connections, but without, like, spending weeks digging through mountains of information.
Yeah, absolutely. Information overload is real.
Exactly. So that's what we're aiming for here today. We're doing a deep dive into the grand story of us, human history, how our societies work, the whole massive journey. We've pulled together some fascinating sources.
We have, and they really cover a huge sweep of time. We're talking right from the emergence of Homo sapiens, our species, all the way up to, well, really modern ideas like global capitalism and even bioengineering.
It's a broad scope, for sure. But the mission today is to pull out some of the most surprising facts, the connections you might not expect.
Think of it as a way to get up to speed, to feel really well informed on some big topics, but hopefully in a way that doesn't feel like homework.
Right. A shortcut to sounding smart at your next dinner party? Maybe. But seriously, we want to give you a solid, nuanced grasp of some really key parts of our story. Okay, so where should we start? Maybe with something that seems, well, normal now, but apparently wasn't always.
Let's talk about us being alone, as the only human species.
Alone, how do you mean?
Well, it feels like the default state, right? Just Homo sapiens on Earth. But the sources we looked at make it clear that's actually the exception, not the rule. For most of human history, going back maybe 2 million years, right up until about 10,000 years ago,
Okay.
Earth was home to multiple human species living at the same time.
Wait, like Neanderthals, I know about them, but others too, simultaneously.
Oh, yeah. Neanderthals, Homo erectus in Asia, the Denisovans, those smaller Homo floresiensis folks in Indonesia. At one point, maybe around 100,000 years ago, there could have been at least 6 different types of humans sharing the planet.
6.
Yeah.
Mind-bending. It's like picturing different breeds of dog people.
It's a useful analogy, actually. I think about the animal kingdom today. We have lots of different kinds of foxes, several species of bears, different types of pigs, all coexisting. That used to be the case for humans.
So the fact that it's just us now, that's the historical oddity.
Precisely. Our current solitude is the anomaly. And, some of the material hints that we, Homo sapiens, might have some, let's say, buried reasons for why we don't dwell too much on the memory of our extinct siblings.
Buried reasons, like guilt
Yeah.
or something else.
It raises questions, doesn't it? What role did we play in their disappearance? Was it direct conflict, competition for resources? Did we interbreed them out of existence in some places? The sources suggest it's a complex picture, and maybe one we've subconsciously repressed. It's a deep, perhaps uncomfortable part of our past.
Yeah, gives you a pause. Okay, so fast forward quite a bit. We're the only ones left. How do we manage to build these huge societies, cities, empires, nations with millions of people who've never met? What was the trick?
The sources really zero in on something quite remarkable: the power of shared fictions. Or you could call them common myths, imagined realities.
Shared fictions, like stories.
Exactly. But incredibly powerful ones. See, in small groups, say up to maybe 150 people, Dunbar's number, roughly cooperation can work based on personal relationships. You know everyone, who to trust, who owes you a favor, that kind of thing.
Right, like a village or a tight-knit tribe. You know the dynamics.
Precisely. But how do you get thousands or millions of strangers to cooperate effectively? You can't possibly know everyone personally. That's where these shared fictions come in. They provide a common ground, a shared understanding that binds people together even if they've never met.
Okay, I need examples. What kind of fictions are we talking about?
Think about religion. 2 Catholics anywhere in the world, even if they're total strangers, can cooperate on building a hospital or, historically, joining a crusade because they share a core belief in God, the church, certain saints, specific rituals. It's a shared narrative.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
National myths are another huge one. Think about patriotism. 2 people from the same country, say Serbia, for example, might risk their lives for each other in a war, even if they've never met, because they believe in the Serbian nation, the flag, a shared history. It's a powerful collective story.
At our legal systems?
Absolutely based on shared fictions. 2 lawyers who are complete strangers can work together to defend someone they don't know because they both believe in the existence of laws, justice, human rights, courts, all concepts that don't exist objectively in nature, but are incredibly powerful within our shared understanding.
So things that feel so solid and real, God, nations, money, human rights, laws, they're all essentially constructs of our collective imagination.
Fundamentally, yes. If you could step outside the human mind, objectively, there are no gods floating in the sky, no lines on the ground defining nations, no inherent value in a piece of paper money, no universal laws of justice written into the fabric of the universe. They exist because we collectively agree they exist.
That's quite a thought. It feels almost flimsy when you put it like that. Our whole world built on stories.
But they aren't flimsy at all in their effect. That's the crucial part. We often look at primitive societies and say, oh, they believe in spirits and totems to keep order. But we rarely recognize that our modern institutions, corporations, legal systems, financial markets operate on the exact same basis.
No, so a corporation feels pretty real. It employs people, makes things.
But what is a corporation legally? It's a fiction, a legal entity created by paperwork and shared belief. Think about a company like Peugeot. It's a legal person, but it doesn't physically exist. Yet this shared story, this legend of Peugeot, allows thousands of people, engineers, factory workers, managers, shareholders, lawyers, customers to cooperate towards common goals. Modern business people and lawyers are, in a way, powerful sorcerers, weaving complex spells with legal documents and contracts.
So a multinational company is basically a very successful, widely believed story that reframes things. But you mentioned these aren't just lies.
Correct. It's a crucial distinction. A lie is usually when someone knows the objective truth but says something different. An imagined reality is something that everyone, or at least a large group, believes in collectively. As long as that shared belief holds, the imagined reality has real power in the world.
Can you give me an example of that power?
Think about the Lion Man statue found in the Stadel Cave in Germany. It's almost 40,000 years old. The person who carved it likely genuinely believed in the existence and power of that spirit or entity. Fast forward to today. Most millionaires genuinely believe in the existence and value of money and the legal framework that protects their wealth. Human rights activists genuinely believe in the inherent worth and rights of every individual. When the UN pressures a country about human rights abuses, nobody involved is necessarily lying. They are operating within a powerful framework built on imagined realities. The UN itself, the concept of a nation-state like Libya, and the very idea of universal human rights.
So we live in a kind of dual reality. There's the objective world of trees, rocks, rivers.
Physics, chemistry, biology.
Right. And then layered on top is this invisible but incredibly influential world of shared beliefs, nations, money, gods, laws, corporations.
Exactly. Ever since the cognitive revolution, maybe 70,000 years ago, when our brains developed the capacity for this kind of abstract thought and complex language, Homo sapiens has existed in this dual reality. And what's really striking is that over millennia, the imagined reality has become more and more powerful. So much so that today, the very survival of objective things, rivers, forests, actual lions, often depends entirely on the decisions made by these imagined entities, like corporations or nations.
That's a powerful thought. The imagined world now dictates the fate of the real one. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. There's often this debate about our distant ancestors, the hunter-gatherers. Were they peaceful, noble savages living in harmony? Or was life back then, nasty, brutish, and short, full of violence? What do the sources suggest?
Yeah, it's a really contentious topic in anthropology and archaeology. You've got basically two main camps. One side pictures ancient foragers as relatively peaceful, egalitarian, maybe living in small bands where major conflict wasn't common. They argued that large-scale warfare really only kicked off later with agriculture, private property, and settled societies.
The peaceful past idea.
Right. Then the other camp argues that violence has always been a part of the human condition, that competition for resources, territory, and mates likely led to frequent conflict, even among early hunter-gatherers. They point to evidence of violence in some skeletal remains and draw parallels with violence seen in some primate groups.
So it was right. Were they hippies or warriors?
Well, the frustrating truth is the evidence is really ambiguous and open to interpretation. We have limited archaeological finds from that deep past, and drawing conclusions from modern hunter-gatherer groups is also tricky.
Why is that tricky? Can't we just observe them?
We can, but most contemporary forager groups live in very isolated areas, often pushed into marginal lands by agricultural or industrial societies. Their population densities are usually low, which naturally reduces the potential for large-scale conflict. Plus, almost all of them are now living within the boundaries of modern states, which actively suppress intergroup violence. So they might not be representative of the conditions faced by foragers in richer environments thousands of years ago.
Okay, that makes sense. What about actual historical accounts? Do we ever observe larger groups of independent foragers before state control became so widespread?
There were some limited opportunities, yeah. In the 19th century, anthropologists encountered relatively larger and more independent forager populations in places like northwestern North America and northern Australia. And the records from those encounters do suggest that armed conflict between groups was actually quite frequent, sometimes pretty intense.
Ah, so maybe not so peaceful.
Possibly. But again, there's a debate. Was that level of conflict typical of foragers throughout history, or was it perhaps influenced or exacerbated by the pressures of encroaching European colonialism at the time? It's hard to definitively separate those factors.
And the archaeology. What about finding ancient battle sites or weapons?
It's tough. Back then, you didn't have fortifications like castles or city walls. You didn't have swords or shields that are clearly just for fighting. A stone spear point found near a skeleton could be from hunting or from warfare. A cracked skull could be from a fight, an accident, or even a ritual practice.
Right. Ambiguous evidence.
Exactly. And here's a really crucial point the sources make. Even if there was significant warfare, most deaths in pre-industrial conflicts didn't happen during the battle itself. They happened afterward.
Afterwards.
From starvation, because fighting disrupted hunting or gathering. From cold and exposure, if people were driven from their shelters. And especially from disease, which spreads rapidly when populations are stressed, injured, or displaced. These things could kill maybe 90% of the people affected by a conflict, but they leave very few direct marks on skeletons that archaeologists can find tens of thousands of years later.
So a war could be devastating in terms of population loss, but leave almost no smoking gun, archaeologically speaking.
Pretty much. It means the absence of clear skeletal evidence for war doesn't necessarily prove peace. The picture of forager violence, or lack thereof, remains quite murky.
Fascinating and a bit frustrating. Okay, let's talk about our impact on the planet, even way back then. Did early Homo sapiens make a big difference ecologically?
The sources definitely suggest we did. There's a major debate focused on Australia around 45,000 years ago. That's roughly when the first humans are thought to have arrived there.
And what happened then?
Well, shortly after humans arrived, a lot of Australia's unique megafauna, the giant animals, went extinct. We're talking about huge marsupials, some the size of rhinos, giant flightless birds taller than ostriches, massive lizards. A whole range of large creatures vanished relatively quickly.
Whoa! Giant kangaroos disappeared just when people showed up. Sounds suspicious.
It does, doesn't it? And there are basically three main theories trying to explain this extinction event. Theory 1. Humans hunted them to extinction. These animals had evolved without humans around, so they might have been easy prey.
The overkill hypothesis.
Right. Theory 2. Climate change. Australia experienced significant climate shifts around that time, which could have altered habitats and food sources, driving the megafauna to extinction regardless of human presence.
Okay, plausible. What's theory 3?
Theory 3 is a combination. It suggests that maybe the climate was already putting pressure on these large animals, making their populations vulnerable. Then humans arrived, adding hunting pressure and possibly using fire extensively, fire stick farming, to manage the landscape, which further changed habitats. This combination might have been the final nail in the coffin.
Why would large animals be particularly vulnerable to that kind of combined pressure?
Big animals generally reproduce much more slowly than smaller ones. They have fewer offspring, longer gestation periods, take longer to reach maturity, so even a small increase in mortality rate from hunting or habitat loss can cause their populations to decline rapidly because they just can't replace their numbers fast enough. It makes them much more susceptible to collapse when conditions change or a new pressure arrives.
So a perfect storm of climate stress, human hunting, and maybe landscape burning.
That's the idea behind the combination theory. But honestly, the sources acknowledge we don't have definitive proof to firmly choose between these three scenarios yet. There's evidence pointing in each direction, but the exact cause or the weighting of the different factors for the Australian megafauna extinction is still debated.
Another historical mystery. Okay, let's jump forward again to something truly mind-boggling. Göbekli Tepe. This site seems to turn a lot of old ideas about early civilization on their head.
It really does. Göbekli Tepe is in southeastern Turkey, and it dates back to around 9500 BCE. That's staggeringly old. What's incredible is that it consists of these massive circular structures with huge T-shaped stone pillars, many elaborately carved with animals like foxes, snakes, boars, cranes.
Okay, massive carved stone pillars.
And here's the kicker. It was built by people who were still hunter-gatherers. This is thousands of years before the invention of agriculture, before settled villages became common, before pottery even.
Hunter-gatherers build stone monuments on that scale. I thought that kind of large-scale construction project only happened after farming allowed for food surpluses and settled populations.
That was the standard thinking. Göbekli Tepe challenges that completely. These clearly weren't houses or practical shelters. They seemed to be ceremonial centers, maybe temples. Building them required immense effort, quarrying the huge stones, moving them, carving them, erecting them. This implies a level of social organization, planning, and shared purpose among these foraging groups that we simply hadn't imagined before.
So they must have had some kind of complex belief system already in place, something powerful enough to motivate different bands to cooperate on this massive project over generations.
It certainly seems that way. A sophisticated religious or ideological system that could unite people across different groups, sustain cooperation, and mobilize labor on a grand scale long before kings or priests in the way we usually think of them. It suggests the spiritual or ideological revolution might have preceded the agricultural one.
That flips the script. Maybe the need to build and maintain places like Göbekli Tepe even pushed people towards agriculture.
That's one really intriguing possibility being explored. Recent genetic studies show that einkorn wheat, one of the first crops domesticated, originated in the hills very close to Göbekli Tepe, just about 30 kilometers away.
Wow. So maybe the large gatherings of people needed to build and use the site created a demand for more reliable food sources, accelerating the move towards cultivating wild grains.
It's a compelling hypothesis. Perhaps the temple came first, and the settled agricultural village grew up around it to support it, rather than the other way around. Göbekli Tepe is still yielding secrets, but it's already fundamentally changed our understanding of that transition period.
Okay, so we've established the power of these shared beliefs, these imagined orders. How do societies actually keep them going? How do you make sure everyone keeps believing in things like gods or nations or money or human rights generation after generation?
The sources point to two main interlocking strategies that societies use, often unconsciously, to maintain belief in these imagined orders.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, you never ever admit that the order is imagined. You insist vehemently that it's an objective reality and eternal truth. Usually you claim it was created by gods or that it's based on immutable natural laws.
Give me an example.
Think of Hammurabi's code in ancient Babylon. Hammurabi didn't say, "Here are some useful rules I came up with." He claimed the gods Enlil and Marduk personally gave him the laws. That gives them divine authority. Or look at the U.S. Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson didn't argue for equality based on his own opinion. He wrote that humans are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Grounding it in divine will or nature makes it seem objective.
Even free market capitalism gets presented that way sometimes, right? As just reflecting natural economic laws.
Exactly. Adam Smith talked about the invisible hand, suggesting market forces operate according to natural principles, not just human agreements. So, strategy one is anchor the imagined order in supposed objective reality.
Okay, makes sense. What's the second strategy?
The second strategy is thorough and relentless education, embedding the principles of the imagined order into absolutely everything. It's not just formal schooling, it's woven into the fabric of everyday life.
How so? Like propaganda?
Propaganda is part of it, sure, but it's much broader and often more subtle. Think about fairy tales children hear, the plots of plays and movies, the styles of art and music, architecture, fashion, even etiquette and recipes. They all subtly reinforce the core assumptions and values of the society's imagined order.
Can you give an example of that, maybe with fashion?
Sure, think about clothing. In medieval Europe, a nobleman would never dream of dressing like a peasant, and vice versa. The clothing instantly signaled your fixed place in the social hierarchy, an order believed to be God-given. Today, in many Western societies, the fact that a billionaire might wear jeans and a t-shirt, originally working-class clothes, reflects a different imagined order, one that emphasizes, at least superficially, equality and individualism. The very clothes we wear embody and transmit these underlying beliefs.
Even titles like sir or madam?
Absolutely. Those used to be titles restricted to the nobility, signifying real power and privilege within that hierarchical order. Now, they're often used as general terms of polite address, reflecting a shift towards a more egalitarian ideal, at least in theory. So these imagined orders are constantly reinforced through countless cultural channels, making them feel natural and inevitable. And, as the sources note, a lot of what the humanities and social sciences do is actually study how these imagined orders are constructed, maintained, and how they shape our lives.
It's like the Matrix, but built out of shared ideas instead of code. Okay, let's switch to a more practical side of things. How did early complex societies even manage information? We have computers, databases. What did they do with, say, thousands of clay tablets?
That's a fantastic question, and it highlights a critical bottleneck in the development of large-scale societies. Imagine you're an ancient Sumer, and there's a dispute over land ownership. The records are all on clay tablets, maybe thousands of them stored somewhere. How do you even find the right tablet? How do you know it's the most recent one? How do you verify it?
Yeah, sounds like an absolute nightmare. Just finding the data would be impossible.
It would be incredibly difficult without systems. Simply inventing writing wasn't enough. To make written records truly useful for governing a large state or managing a complex economy, you need methods for processing that information efficiently.
What kinds of methods?
You need ways to organize the records, maybe early forms of cataloging or filing systems. You need ways to reproduce information accurately if needed. You need ways to retrieve specific records, quickly search mechanisms, however primitive. And crucially, you need trained people, scribes, clerks, archivists, librarians who know how to use these systems.
So the invention of bureaucracy and information management was almost as important as the invention of writing itself.
Arguably more so in terms of enabling large-scale social organization. The sources emphasize that inventing these data processing methods was often much harder and took longer than inventing the script itself. Many cultures developed writing, but their systems remain limited because they didn't develop effective ways to archive, catalog, and retrieve the information.
Which societies did figure it out early on?
The really successful early empires, Sumer, ancient Egypt, China, the Inca Empire, even with their non-script Khufu system, were successful partly because they developed relatively sophisticated techniques for managing information. They invested in record-keeping infrastructure and in the specialized personnel needed to run it. Efficient bureaucracy was a key pillar of their power.
It really underscores that information is power, even thousands of years ago. Okay, let's talk about something that often goes hand in hand with complex societies: social hierarchies and discrimination. How did these arise from those imagined communities we discussed?
Well, as soon as you create an us based on a shared imagined identity, like being part of the same nation or religion or class, you inevitably also create a them. These distinctions allow people within the us group to interact with each other, even as strangers, based on assumptions derived from that shared identity. But it also allows them to treat them differently, often prejudicially.
Can you give an example of how that works in practice?
Think about George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion. Professor Higgins can instantly place Eliza Doolittle socially just by hearing her accent. Her speech marks her as belonging to a lower class and dictates how she's initially treated. We do this constantly, often unconsciously. A shopkeeper might subtly alter their behavior based on assumptions made about a customer's clothes, speech, or appearance, slotting them into a perceived social category.
And these categories can then solidify into rigid hierarchies.
Exactly. And these hierarchies then get justified and perpetuated by myths, stories that explain why the hierarchy is natural, inevitable, or even divinely ordained. The most brutal example is probably racial hierarchy used to justify slavery in the Americas.
How was that justified?
Elaborate myths were constructed, often drawing on distorted religious interpretations or early, flawed scientific theories, to claim that people of African descent were inherently inferior, less intelligent, perhaps even lacking souls, and therefore naturally suited for enslavement. These were powerful imagined realities used to uphold an incredibly cruel system.
And these myths didn't just disappear when slavery was legally abolished, did they?
Absolutely not. That's the insidious nature of these things. Even after slavery ended, the deeply ingrained racist myths persisted. Combined with the massive economic disadvantages imposed by centuries of slavery, this created a vicious cycle. A Black person in the American South in, say, 1895 faced enormous discrimination in getting jobs, education, housing, not because of any objective lack of ability, but because the imagined hierarchy, the racist myth, was still operating powerfully in society, creating real-world barriers.
So the imagined order creates real disadvantages, which then seem to confirm the prejudice, reinforcing the cycle.
Precisely. It's a self-perpetuating loop that can be incredibly difficult to break. Even long after the original justifications are discredited or legally overturned, it shows just how potent and lasting these imagined social structures can be.
It's a stark reminder. Okay, let's zoom out again. Looking at the very long arc of history, does it seem to be heading in a particular direction? Is there an overall trend?
When you take a really high-level view, spanning millennia, the sources do suggest a general direction. The gradual merging of small, distinct human cultures into larger, more complex civilizations. Over time, the number of separate human worlds has decreased, while the size and interconnectedness of the remaining ones have increased. We're moving towards fewer, bigger megacultures.
So a trend towards unity, or at least interconnection, despite all the wars and collapsing empires we see throughout history.
Yes. Those breakups, like the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire, or the various schisms in Christianity, or Latin evolving into different Romance languages, can be seen as temporary eddies or countercurrents within a much larger, slower-moving river flowing towards global integration.
It's an interesting perspective. But our perception of that direction depends on where we're standing, right?
Absolutely. It's a perspective heavily influenced by our current position. Someone living through the collapse of the Western Roman Empire might not have perceived any long-term trend towards unity, and what looks like a clear direction to us might seem like just one phase to historians thousands of years from now. But from our vantage point, the coalescence seems to be the dominant long-term pattern.
Cool. Let's tackle something central to that interconnectedness. Money. We use it every day. But what is it, really?
Fundamentally, money is another imagined reality. Its value doesn't come from the material it's made of, whether it's a cowrie shell, a gold coin, a printed piece of paper, or just electrons in a computer. Its value exists purely in our collective imagination and our shared trust that others will accept it in exchange for goods and services.
So it's all about trust. A dollar bill's only worth something because we all agree it's worth something.
Exactly. Money is a system of mutual trust. And importantly, it's not just trust between two individuals making a transaction. It's trust embedded in incredibly complex and long-term political, social, and economic networks. You trust the dollar because your grocer trusts it, who trusts the wholesaler, who trusts the bank, which trusts the government.
It's a web of belief.
It is. Look closely at a U.S. dollar bill. You see phrases like, "In God we trust," the signature of the Secretary of the Treasury. These aren't just decorations. They are symbols designed to anchor that trust, linking the financial system to political authority and even deeper cultural or religious beliefs. It shows how tightly money is interwoven with our political, social, and ideological systems. A crisis in one can easily spill over into the others.
Did money always exist in this abstract form? What were the origins?
The earliest forms were often things with some intrinsic value. The sources mention Sumerian barley money, dating back thousands of years. Barley could be eaten, so it had inherent biological value. But even then, getting people to accept a specific amount of barley as a standard equivalent for all other goods and services required establishing widespread trust and standardization. And barley, while useful, was bulky, perishable, hard to transport. So societies gradually moved towards more symbolic forms of money, like precious metals and eventually paper and digital currency, which rely almost entirely on that shared psychological construct of trust.
Let's talk about empires again. We touched on their justifications, but what was the deeper imperial drive, and how did they handle the cultures they absorbed?
Empires, almost by definition, have a universalistic vision. Their leaders tend to believe they represent a superior order and that expanding their rule is beneficial for everyone, including the conquered. They see themselves as bringing civilization, peace, prosperity, or the true faith to supposedly less advanced peoples.
We see this narrative repeated constantly, don't we? Rome bringing the Pax Romana.
Exactly. Or China having the mandate of heaven to rule all under heaven. The Mauryan Empire spreading Buddhism, Muslim caliphs spreading the Prophet's message, European powers bringing Christianity and civilization, the Soviets promoting communism, the U.S. advocating democracy and human rights. The specific content changes, but the underlying belief in the universal validity and benefit of their own system is a common thread.
But you mentioned earlier that imperial cultures often weren't purely imposed, they absorbed things too.
Yes, that's a key point. Because their vision is often universal and theoretically inclusive, empires tend to be cultural melting pots. They often adopt and adapt ideas, technologies, foods, artistic styles, and even gods or administrative practices from the peoples they conquer. Think of Roman culture absorbing so much from Greece, or the Abbasid Caliphate blending Persian, Greek, and Arab elements, or the Mongols adopting Chinese administrative methods, or the incredible cultural diversity within the modern U.S. Imperial cultures are usually hybrids.
But that assimilation process wasn't necessarily easy for the conquered people, was it?
Yeah, definitely not. For the vanquished, being absorbed into an empire often meant the painful loss of their own traditions, languages, and autonomy. And even if the empire was theoretically inclusive, it could take generations, if ever, for conquered peoples to be fully accepted by the ruling elite. There was often a long, difficult period of being second-class citizens within the new imperial order.
Okay, shifting to religion again, we talked about monotheism's rise. Why did it become so dominant over polytheism?
Well, over the last 2 millennia, there's been this major shift. The sources suggest that monotheists believing in one singular, all-powerful God tend to be inherently more fervent, more missionary, and often more intolerant of competing beliefs than polytheists typically were.
Why more intolerant?
If you believe your God is the only true God and holds the entire truth, then by definition, all other gods must be false idols and all other religions must be wrong or at least incomplete. This conviction can create a powerful drive to convert others, sometimes forcefully, and to eliminate competing faiths. Polytheistic systems, which acknowledge many gods, often found it easier to accept or incorporate new deities.
So this inherent exclusivity gave monotheism a kind of competitive advantage in spreading.
It seems to have fueled a greater missionary zeal, and historically it led to more sustained and often violent efforts to suppress or eradicate rival religions. From being a small minority viewpoint at the start of the Common Era, monotheism gradually gained ground, often through conquest and conversion campaigns, eventually dominating much of the Afro-Eurasian landmass and becoming a major force shaping the global political order.
But did polytheism and older animistic beliefs just vanish completely?
Not entirely. It's fascinating, actually. Just like animistic beliefs often survived within polytheistic frameworks, many polytheistic elements belief in saints acting as intermediaries, veneration of specific shrines or relics, rituals that echo older traditions have persisted within mainstream monotheistic religions. This blending, or syncretism, is incredibly common. Some argue that pure monotheism is rare in practice. Most people, historically and today, practice a version that incorporates these older layers of belief.
Interesting. Now, what about belief systems that don't focus on gods at all? What about humanism?
Humanism represents a major category of modern belief systems, ones that, instead of worshiping gods, effectively worship humanity, Homo sapiens. The core idea is that humans possess a unique and sacred nature, fundamentally different from and superior to all other beings or phenomena in the universe.
So humans are the ultimate value.
In humanist thought, yes. The supreme good is the good of Homo sapiens. The rest of the world and the universe derive their value primarily from their relationship to humans and their potential to benefit us. Our experiences, our creativity, our well-being, these are considered the most important things.
But just like other belief systems, humanism isn't monolithic, is it? There are different flavors.
Exactly. It's split into various sects, often with quite different ideas about what humanity truly means and what its good entails. The most influential type today is probably liberal humanism.
What's the core idea of liberal humanism?
Liberal humanism emphasizes the individual. It believes that the sacredness of humanity resides within each unique person. The ultimate source of meaning and authority comes from the individual's own feelings, experiences, and choices, the inner voice. Freedom and protecting the individual's autonomy are paramount.
And this is where the idea of human rights comes from.
Precisely. The modern concept of universal human rights is a direct expression of liberal humanism. The idea that every individual possesses inherent worth and deserves certain protections simply by virtue of being human.
Are there competing humanist views?
Oh, yes. There's socialist humanism, which tends to see humanity more as a collective. It prioritizes the equality of all humans and believes the experiences and interests of the collective society or specific classes within it should take precedence over individual liberties. The goal is equality, often achieved through state action.
Okay, so individual liberty versus collective equality. What else?
Then there's evolutionary humanism. This branch believes that humankind is not fixed but can be improved, perhaps even evolve into a superhuman form. Historically, this took the form of advocating selective breeding or eugenics.
That sounds problematic, especially thinking about the 20th century.
Extremely problematic. The most horrific example is Nazi ideology. The Nazis were evolutionary humanists in a particularly twisted way. They believed the Aryan race was superior and needed to be protected from degeneration by inferior races or individuals deemed unfit. This led directly to their programs of forced sterilization, euthanasia, and ultimately genocide. While their specific racial theories were pseudoscience, the underlying framework that humanity can and should be improved by eliminating the unfit was a horrifying application of evolutionary humanist ideas that were actually quite widespread in various forms in the early 20th century.
A truly chilling example of how these abstract beliefs can have devastating real-world consequences.
Absolutely. The horrors of Nazism led to a strong backlash against evolutionary humanism after World War II. But interestingly, the sources note that with the rise of genetic engineering and biotechnology, ideas about upgrading humans, enhancing intelligence, extending lifespan, eliminating undesirable traits are resurfacing, albeit usually framed in therapeutic or enhancement terms rather than overtly racial ones.
So the dream of redesigning humanity hasn't entirely gone away. Okay, looking back across this vast sweep of history, if we had to pinpoint the secret of success, why history unfolded the way it did, why some groups or ideas spread, what would it be?
Well, the sources suggest the broad trend towards global unification was probably inevitable, just given the dynamics of cultural exchange and competition over millennia. But which specific culture, language, or ideology became dominant, like English becoming a global language, or certain religions spreading widely, that seems much more contingent, dependent on specific historical events and accidents?
So some inevitability in the big picture, but lots of chance in the details.
Kind of. But if you ask what characteristics allowed certain types of systems or cultures to succeed over the long haul, two things stand out: increasing interconnectedness and the power of shared imagined orders to facilitate large-scale cooperation and adaptation. Societies that developed more effective ways to connect people and ideas and more compelling and flexible shared narratives seem to have had an edge.
Adaptability and shared stories. Interesting. Now let's talk about another huge shift, the scientific revolution. How did that change our fundamental approach to knowledge?
It was a profound shift. Before the scientific revolution, knowledge was primarily based on tradition, religious texts, and philosophical reasoning. The revolution introduced the idea that true knowledge about how the universe works comes from observation, experimentation, and crucially, expressing those observations in the language of mathematics.
So moving from accepting ancient wisdom to actively testing and measuring the world.
Exactly. People started believing the book of nature was written in mathematical language, as Galileo famously put it. Isaac Newton's laws of motion and gravity were a landmark achievement, showing how complex phenomena could be described by relatively simple mathematical equations, and these equations could be used to make accurate predictions.
Did this mathematical approach apply only to physics?
Initially, the biggest breakthroughs were in physics and astronomy. Attempts to apply simple Newtonian-style laws directly to biology or society didn't work as well, because those systems are far more complex. But the spirit of quantification led to the development of new mathematical tools, especially statistics, which allowed scientists to start analyzing patterns and probabilities in these more complex fields: biology, economics, even psychology.
Can you give an example of that shift in thinking?
There's a great example in the sources about two Presbyterian ministers in Scotland in the mid-18th century. They wanted to set up a life insurance fund for the widows and orphans of clergy. Instead of just praying for guidance or relying on scripture, they collected data on when ministers typically died and used the statistical calculations probability theory developed by mathematicians like Pascal and Bernoulli to figure out how much each minister needed to contribute to make the fund financially viable.
They used math and data to create an insurance scheme. That feels very modern.
It was. It showed a reliance on empirical data and mathematical reasoning to solve a practical problem, rather than solely relying on religious tradition. And today, of course, statistics is fundamental to almost every scientific field. This revolution also changed why we seek knowledge.
How so? What became the new goal?
Francis Bacon, an early proponent of the scientific method, famously said, "Knowledge is power." The emphasis shifted. The test of good knowledge became less about whether it was true in an absolute philosophical or religious sense, and more about whether it was useful. Does it allow us to do new things, to build better machines, cure diseases, win wars? Utility became a primary justification for scientific inquiry.
And this focus on utility forged a strong link between science and technology.
Yes, though that link took time to fully develop. For much of history, science, or natural philosophy and technology, craftsmanship and invention, were largely separate pursuits. But from about 1500 onwards, and accelerating dramatically later, they began to feed into each other, creating a powerful cycle of discovery and innovation. Science provided insights that led to new technologies, and new technologies provided better tools for scientific investigation.
And this science-technology link had a huge impact on warfare, right?
Massive. We mentioned the atomic bomb, a direct result of breakthroughs in theoretical physics. Today, military dominance relies heavily on technological superiority, stealth aircraft, precision missiles, cyber warfare capabilities, advanced surveillance. There's a constant drive for technological solutions to security threats, like developing nanorobots for spying or using brain scans for lie detection.
Was technology always the deciding factor in military success?
Not necessarily. Until the 19th century, the sources argue most major military revolutions were more about organization, discipline, logistics, and strategy than about having vastly superior weapons. The Roman legions weren't successful just because of their swords, it was their training, organization, and engineering capabilities. The early Arab and Mongol conquests relied more on innovative tactics and motivation than on technological superiority over their enemies.
So the overwhelming importance of technology in warfare is relatively recent.
Compared to the long sweep of history, yes. Imagine transporting a Roman general like Scipio Aemilianus to the time of Constantine the Great a few centuries later. He'd notice differences, but could probably still function. But transport Napoleon to the 21st century facing a modern armored brigade with air support? He'd be utterly lost. The technological gap has become immense.
But science itself doesn't decide how his discoveries are used, does it? It doesn't set the research priorities.
No, absolutely not. Science is a method for understanding reality, but it's value neutral in itself. It can tell us how to manipulate genes, but it can't tell us whether we should use that knowledge to cure cancer, create designer babies, or engineer more productive farm animals. Those decisions, what research gets funded, what applications are pursued, are driven by political, economic, and ideological forces.
So science needs an ally, an ideology or belief system to give it direction and funding.
That's the argument. Scientific research is expensive and often has uncertain outcomes. It tends to flourish when it's allied with some religion or ideology that justifies the cost and provides a framework for its goals. For the last 500 years, the sources argue the two most important allies driving scientific progress have been European imperialism and capitalism.
Imperialism and capitalism fueled science.
Yeah. Imperialism provided both the motivation, controlling territories, accessing resources, proving superiority, and the funding for exploration, mapping, botany, anthropology, medicine sciences that were useful for governing empires. Capitalism provided the belief in progress and growth, the investment mechanisms, and the relentless drive for innovations that could increase production and profits, which in turn funded more scientific research aimed at creating new products, processes, and markets.
Let's dig into capitalism then. You said it's almost like a religion. What's its core belief?
The core belief, the central dogma of modern capitalism, is growth. The idea that the economy must constantly expand, that production must always increase. This is actually a very new idea in human history. For millennia, economies were relatively static. Total global production didn't change much year to year. But since around 1500, and especially after the Industrial Revolution, economic growth has become the norm, the expectation, the primary goal.
How does this growth actually happen? Where does the money come from to fund new ventures before they make a profit?
It comes from credit. Capitalism is fundamentally based on trust in the future. People, banks, investors, extend credit, essentially imaginary money, to entrepreneurs based on the belief that their future ventures will succeed and generate enough profit to pay back the loan with interest. This allows new businesses to start and existing ones to expand, driving overall growth.
So it's built on optimism about the future.
Yes, and a specific ethic, reinvesting profits. The capitalist ideal isn't just to make money, but to reinvest that money back into production, building more factories, developing new products, hiring more workers in order to make even more money in the future. This relentless cycle of reinvestment fuels the growth engine.
And trust is absolutely essential for this system to work.
Absolutely critical. Investors need to trust that entrepreneurs will succeed, that contracts will be honored, that property rights will be protected, that the political system is stable. The sources contrast 17th century Spain and the Netherlands. The Dutch Republic built strong institutions that protected private property and enforced contracts, fostering investor trust. Spain, with a more arbitrary monarchy, struggled to gain the same level of confidence. This difference in trust had huge consequences for their respective economic development and imperial power.
And this need for large-scale investment led to things like stock markets.
Exactly. Financing really big, risky ventures like long-distance trading voyages or building large factories was often too much for a single individual or even the state. So mechanisms like joint stock companies, like the famous Dutch East India Company, emerged, allowing many investors to pool their capital and share the risks and profits. Stock exchanges developed as places to buy and sell shares in these companies, making investment more liquid and further fueling economic activity and empire building. But again, it all hinges on trust. When trust collapses, like in the French Mississippi bubble disaster, the whole system can crash spectacularly.
And then came the Industrial Revolution, pouring fuel on this capitalist fire. What was the essence of that revolution?
At its heart, the Industrial Revolution was about energy conversion. Humans discovered ways to tap into vast new sources of energy, primarily fossil fuels like coal, later oil and gas, and crucially invented efficient ways to convert that energy into useful work, especially mechanical motion.
So it wasn't just about inventing machines, but about finding the power to run them on an unprecedented scale.
Precisely. For millennia, human societies relied on muscle power, human and animal, wind and water, all limited and geographically constrained. The Industrial Revolution unlocked the concentrated energy stored in fossil fuels, making it seem like energy was almost limitless. Every time we seemed close to running out of one source, new discoveries or technologies opened up others. Even today, with concerns about fossil fuels, we know there's vastly more energy available from sources like solar, nuclear, or even gravity if we can develop the technologies to harness them efficiently.
And the steam engine was the iconic invention of this era.
It was certainly one of the most transformative. The ability to convert heat from burning coal into motion powered the first factories, pumped water out of mines, allowing deeper extraction of coal, and drove locomotives and steamships, revolutionizing transportation and trade. It fundamentally changed humanity's relationship with energy and work.
But all this increased production needed buyers. Did another revolution happen alongside the industrial one?
Yes, a parallel revolution in consumption, the rise of consumerism. To keep the capitalist engine growing, you don't just need to produce more, people need to buy more. Consumerism is the ideology that encourages acquiring more goods and services, promoting the idea that this leads to happiness and fulfillment.
How did that become such a dominant ethic? Weren't traditional values often about frugality and saving?
They were in many cultures. Consumerism had to be actively cultivated. Advertising played a huge role, creating desires for things people didn't previously know they needed. Planned obsolescence encouraged replacing items, and cultural values shifted towards embracing indulgence, novelty, and materialism. Thrift became old-fashioned. Spending became patriotic or therapeutic.
It's a strange loop. We work harder to make more stuff so we can buy more stuff.
And the system requires it to keep growing. The sources highlight the paradox in the modern food market. We have unprecedented levels of obesity caused by overconsumption, alongside a massive diet industry selling products to help us lose weight, essentially profiting from both sides of the consumption equation.
Okay, so we have this massive expansion of the state and the market, driven by science, capitalism, and consumerism. What impact has this had on older social structures, like the family and the local community?
The sources argue that over the last 2 centuries, the rise of the state and the market has significantly weakened the traditional bonds of family and local community. They've essentially taken over many of the functions those structures used to perform.
How so? Give me some examples.
Well, think about security. Instead of relying on family vendettas or local militias, we now have state police forces and national armies. Education used to happen largely within the family or local community. Now it's primarily handled by state-run schools. Healthcare, elder care, dispute resolution, increasingly provided or regulated by the state or purchased as services on the market rather than handled within the family or village.
And the market's influence.
The market offers individuals choices and opportunities far beyond their local community jobs, goods, partners, identities. Local traditions and loyalties often get replaced by commercial trends and national or global affiliations. You might feel more connection to fans of the same global football team than to your geographical neighbors.
What are the consequences of this shift? Is it good or bad?
It's presented as a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it liberates individuals from the often stifling constraints of traditional families and communities. It offers more freedom, more mobility, potentially more equality, especially for women and minorities who might have been oppressed by traditional structures.
But the downside?
The downside is a potential weakening of intimate bonds and social safety nets. The state and market offer imagined communities the nation, consumer tribes, which might feel less emotionally resonant or supportive than the close-knit ties of family and village. This can lead to feelings of alienation, loneliness, and a reliance on impersonal institutions rather than personal relationships for support.
A trade-off between individual freedom and communal belonging. Okay, one more look at the big picture. Given all this massive change, conflict, the rise and fall of ideologies, are we actually living in more peaceful times now or more violent ones? The 20th century felt incredibly violent.
It certainly did, with 2 world wars, the Holocaust, numerous genocides and revolutions. It's easy to see the last couple of centuries as exceptionally bloody. However, the sources make a rather surprising argument, statistically speaking,
Which is?
that the period since 1945, despite the Cold War, nuclear threats, and numerous regional conflicts, has actually been the most peaceful era in recorded human history, at least in terms of the proportion of people dying from human violence.
Really? More peaceful than ancient times or the Middle Ages? That seems counterintuitive.
It does, but the argument is based on data suggesting that the rates of violent death, both in warfare and from interpersonal violence, were likely much higher proportionally in most pre-state societies and even in earlier state societies compared to the post-WWII era. The sheer scale of violence in the 20th century was unprecedented due to population size and technology, but the likelihood of an individual dying violently may have decreased.
Why would that be? What changed after 1945?
Several factors are proposed. The existence of nuclear weapons perhaps created a long peace between major powers due to mutually assured destruction. The increasing economic interdependence through globalization makes war more costly and less profitable. The power of states to suppress internal violence has generally increased, and international norms and institutions, while imperfect, may exert some restraining influence. The current global order, for all its flaws, seems surprisingly resilient at preventing large-scale interstate war compared to previous eras.
So this new elastic order can handle massive change without constant major wars.
That's the hypothesis, though it's crucial to add some caveats. First, this relative peace hasn't been experienced equally everywhere. Many regions have suffered terrible violence. Second, judging historical progress from a comfortable Western perspective can be misleading. And third, this golden age of relative peace might just be a temporary anomaly, not a permanent state. Future challenges could easily shatter it.
Important caveats. Okay, let's look towards the future now. The sources talk about a potential biological revolution driven by intelligent design. What does that mean?
It means moving beyond just understanding biology, as we've been doing, to actively redesigning it. For billions of years, life evolved through natural selection. The next great revolution, potentially, involves replacing natural selection with intelligent design, our intelligence as the primary force shaping life.
How would we do that?
Through technologies like genetic engineering, creating cyborgs, merging organic and inorganic parts, and possibly even creating entirely artificial inorganic life forms, we're moving from merely reading the genetic code to actively writing and editing it.
Can you give an example?
A somewhat provocative early example was Eduardo Palec's ALBA project, a rabbit engineered with a jellyfish gene to make it glow green under certain light. While controversial, it demonstrated the principle, deliberately altering the biological makeup of a living creature based on human design.
So we're becoming the intelligent designers that some religious groups talk about, but through science, not divinity.
There's a certain irony there, isn't there? While biologists firmly hold that life in the past evolved through natural selection, the proponents of intelligent design might, in a strange way, be right about the future, a future where life is increasingly shaped by conscious design, albeit human design.
What are the main pathways for this? You mentioned genetic engineering.
Right. Biological engineering is one. Directly altering genes to change organisms, including potentially humans. Another is cyborg engineering, merging humans with machines. Think sophisticated prosthetic limbs, brain-computer interfaces, maybe even nanobots in our bloodstream. The third, more speculative path is engineering inorganic life, creating truly artificial intelligences or robots that possess consciousness or lifelike qualities.
And what could this mean for us, for Homo sapiens? Are we talking about fundamentally changing ourselves?
That seems to be the potential endpoint. We're already manipulating human biology in significant ways. Hormone therapies, reconstructive surgeries, early gene therapies. The ability to make deeper changes at the genetic level is rapidly increasing.
Like the idea of bringing back Neanderthals.
That's a speculative example often raised. Theoretically, if we could sequence the full Neanderthal genome and develop the technology, maybe, but the ethical and practical hurdles are immense. The more profound question, perhaps, is not about resurrecting extinct species, but redesigning our own.
Redesigning humans.
If we can map the genetic basis for traits like intelligence, longevity, temperament, could we and should we engineer better humans? Alter our physiology to live longer, enhance our cognitive abilities, change our emotional capacities to be less aggressive or more empathetic.
That sounds like science fiction, but maybe it's closer than we think.
Consider this. The cognitive revolution that made us human involved relatively small changes in brain wiring and genetics compared to our ape ancestors. What if another, perhaps engineered, set of small changes could trigger a second cognitive revolution, creating a being with consciousness fundamentally different from our own?
Are people actually researching this? Isn't it banned?
Direct genetic engineering of the human germline is highly controversial and restricted in most places due to profound ethical concerns. But research into gene therapy for diseases, cognitive enhancement drugs, and brain-computer interfaces is advancing rapidly. The line between therapy and enhancement can be blurry. Imagine a cure for Alzheimer's that also significantly boosts memory in healthy people. Could we resist using it for enhancement?
Probably not easily. So the ultimate outcome might be the end of Homo sapiens.
In a sense, not necessarily through extinction, but through transformation. If we extensively modify ourselves through bioengineering or cyborg technology, the beings that result might be so different from us in their biology, capabilities, and consciousness that they constitute a new species or something else entirely. Bioengineering might not bring back the Neanderthals, but it could very well mean the end of Homo sapiens as we've known ourselves for the past tens of thousands of years.
Wow. Okay. From sharing the planet with other humans, to building global societies on shared stories, to potentially designing our own successors, that is quite the arc we've covered in this deep dive. It's a lot to process.
It really is. The scale of human history and the forces shaping it are immense.
So if you had to boil it down, what are the really crucial takeaways from everything we've discussed today?
I think a key theme is the incredible power of collective belief, these imagined orders, in shaping everything from our social structures and economies to our ethics and even our relationship with the physical world. Another is the accelerating pace of change driven by science and technology, especially the fusion of information and biological revolutions, which now seems poised to potentially reshape humanity itself. And underlying it all is this constant tension between our biological inheritance and our unique capacity for cultural creation and adaptation.
It certainly gives you a much deeper framework for understanding not just the past, but also the present and the potential futures unfolding around us. It goes way beyond just knowing names and dates.
Hopefully it sparks some new ways of thinking about who we are and where we might be heading.
Definitely. So maybe a final thought to leave our listeners with, something to chew on.
Well, given everything we've talked about, the power of our shared myths, our ability to cooperate in vast numbers based on these fictions, and now our rapidly growing power to literally rewrite the code of life through bioengineering. Maybe the most important question is, what kind of future are we collectively choosing to imagine and create? Because our imagined realities seem to have a very real habit of becoming objective realities down the line.
What future are we writing into existence? That's a powerful question indeed. It certainly invites further reflection and encourages everyone to keep exploring these incredibly important topics. Thank you for guiding us through this fascinating deep dive.
My pleasure. It's endlessly fascinating stuff.